In all that matters, I was an only child. There was a brother once, but I never saw him, even though he lived several years. My father, a Scottish solicitor or law agent, and very much a Scot, applied himself early to becoming an English barrister and, as happens to Scots, was made a judge of the High Court, when barely in middle age. In court, he was stupendous. From the first, I was taken once every 10 days by Cuddy, my nurse, to the public gallery in order to behold him and hearken to him for 40 minutes or so. If I made the slightest stir or whimper, it was subtly but effectively repaid me, on those and all other occasions. Judges today are neither better nor worse than my father, but they are different. At home, my father, only briefly visible, was as a wraith with a will and power that no one available could resist. The will and power lingered undiminished when my father was not in the house, which, in the nature of things, was for most of the time. As well as the court and the chambers, there were the club and the dining club, the livery company and the military historical society, all of which my father attended with dedication and sacrifice. With equal regularity, he pursued the cult of self-defense in several different branches and with little heed for the years. He was an elder of a Scottish church in a London suburb, at some distance from where we lived. He presided over several successive royal commissions, until one day he threw up his current presidency in a rage of principle and was never invited again. After his death, I realized that a further center of his interest had been a club of a different kind, a very expensive and sophisticated one. I need not say how untrue it is that Scots are penny-scraping in all things. I was terrified of my father. I feared almost everything, but there was nothing I feared more than to encounter my father or to pick up threads from his intermittent murmurings in the corridors and closets. We lived in a huge house at the center of Belgravia. No judge could afford such an establishment now. In addition, there was the family home of Palapra, modest, comfortless, and very remote. Our ancestry was merely legal and commercial, though those words have vastly more power in Scotland than in England. In Scotland, accomplishments are preferred to graces. As a child, I was never taken to Palapra. I never went there at all until much later, on 2 occasions, as I shall unfold. I was frightened also of Cuddy, properly Miss Hester MacFerrier, and not least when she rambled on, as Scottish women do, of the immense bags and catches ingathered at Palapra by our ancestors and their like-minded acquaintances. She often emphasized how cold the house was at all times and how far from a made road. Only the elect could abide there, one gathered, but there were some who could never bear to leave, and who actually shed tears upon being compelled by the advancing winter to do so. When the snow was on the ground, the house could not be visited at all, not even by the factor to the estate, who lived down by the sea loch, and whose name was Mason. Cuddy had her own methods for compelling the attention of any child to every detail she cared to impart. I cannot recall when I did not know about Mason. He was precisely the man for a Scottish nursemaid to uphold as an example. My father was understood to dislike criminal cases, which, as an advanced legal theorist and technician, he regarded with contempt. He varied the taking of notes at these times by himself sketching in lightning caricature the figures in the dock to his left. The caricatures were ultimately framed, 30 or 40 at a time, whereafter Haverstone, the odd-job man, spent upwards of a week hanging them at different places in our house, according to precise directions written out by my father, well in advance. Anybody who could read at all could at any time read every word my father wrote, despite the millions of words he had to set down as a duty. Most of the other pictures in our house were engravings after Landseer and Millais and Peyton. Generations of Scottish aunts and uncles had also contributed artworks of their own, painstaking and gloomy. I was afraid of Haverstone because of his disfigurements and his huge size. I used to tiptoe away whenever I heard his breathing. I never cared or dared to ask how he had come to be so marked. Perhaps my idea of his bulk was a familiar illusion of childhood. We shall scarcely know. In that Haverstone, one day after my 7th birthday, fell from a railway bridge into the main road beneath and was destroyed by a lorry. Cuddy regarded Haverstone with contempt and never failed to claim that my father employed him only out of pity. I never knew what he was doing on the railway bridge, but later I became aware of a huge mental hospital nearby and drew obvious conclusions. My mother I adored and revered. For better or for worse, one knows the words of Stendhal. My mother was a charming woman, and I was in love with my mother. I wanted to cover my mother with kisses and wished there weren't any clothes. She too loved me passionately. She kissed me, and I returned those kisses sometimes with such passion that she had to leave me. Thus it was with me, and as with Stendhal, so was the sequel. My mother was very dark, darker than me, and very exotic. I must suppose that only the frenzy of Scottish lust brought my father to marrying her. At such times, some Scots lose hold on all other considerations, in a way never noticed by me among Englishmen. By now, my father's fit was long over. At least he did not intrude upon us, as Stendhal's father did. I am sure that jealousy was very prominent in my father, but perhaps he scorned to show it. He simply kept away from his wife entirely. At least as far as I could see. And I saw most things, though facing far from all of them, and acknowledging none of them. Day after day, night after night, I lay for hours at a time in my mother's big bed, with my head between her breasts and my tongue gently extended, as in infancy. The room was perfumed, the bed was perfumed, her nightdress was perfumed, she was perfumed. To a child, it set the idea of heaven. Who wants any other? My mother's body, as well as being so dark, was sorter all over than anyone else's, and sweeter than anything merely physical and fleeting, different and higher altogether. Her rich dark hair, perfumed of itself, fell all about me, as in the East. There was no social life in her home, no visiting acquaintances, no family connections, no chatter. My father had detached himself from his own folk by his marriage. My mother loved no one but me. I am sure of that. I was in a position to know. The only callers were her hairdresser, her dressmaker, her maker of shoes and boots, her perfumier, her fabricator of lingerie, and perhaps one or two others of the kind. While she was shorn, scented, and fitted, I sat silently in the corner on a little gray hassock. None of the callers seemed to object. They knew the world and what it was like, and would soon enough be like for me. They contained themselves. I was there whatever my mother did, without exception. Cuddy dragged me off at intervals for fresh air, but not for very long. I could see for myself that Cuddy, almost familiar with my father, was afraid of my mother. I never knew why, and am far from certain now, but was glad of the fact. It was the key circumstance that transformed the potential of utter wretchedness for me into utter temporary bliss. My mother taught me all I know that matters, smiling and laughing and holding me and rewarding me, so that always I was precocity incarnate, alike in concepts, dignity, and languages. Unfortunately, my mother was often ill, commonly for days, sometimes for weeks, and who is there to care, apart from me, who could do nothing, even if there was something that others could have done? My lessons ceased for a spell, but as soon as possible or sooner were bravely resumed. Later, I strayed through other places of education, defending myself as best I could, and not unsuccessfully either, and, of what I needed, learning what I could. It was not my father who dispatched me. He regarded me without interest or expectation. To him I was the enduring reminder of a season's weakness. The ultimate care of me lay with trustees, as often in Scotland, though only once did I see them as individuals, and hardly even then, because the afternoon was overcast and all the lights were weak, for some reason that I forget. Before all that formal education, I had encountered the woman on the stairs. This brief and almost illusory episode was the first of the two turning points in my life, and I suspect the more important. I had been playing on the landing outside the door of my mother's room. I do not know how long she had been ill that time. I feared to count the days, and never did so. I am sure that it was longer than on various previous occasions. I was alarmed, as always, but not especially alarmed. My mother had been instrumental in my being given a railway, a conjuring outfit, and a chemical set, those being the things that small boys were supposed to like. My father should have given me soldiers, forts, and guns, possibly a miniature, but accurate, cricket bat, but he never once gave me anything or spoke at all in our house if he could avoid it, except on unpredictable occasions to himself. Memorably, as I have hinted. I mastered the simple illusions and liked the outfit, but had no one to awe. Even my mother preferred to hug me than for me to draw the ace of spades or a tiny white rabbit from her soft mouth. The chemical effects, chlorine gas and liquid air, I never mastered at that time, nor wished to. The railway I loved, no other word, though it was very miniature, neither 1 gauge in those days, nor 0 gauge, but something smaller than 00. The single train, in the Royal Bavarian livery of before the First World War, clinked round a true circle, but en route it traversed a tunnel with 2 cows painted on top and 1 painted sheep, and passed through 2 separate stations, where both passengers and staff were painted on the tin walls, and all the signs were in Gothic. That day I had stopped playing, owing to the beating of my heart, but I had managed to pack everything into the boxes. I needed no bidding to do that, and never had done. I was about to lug the heap upstairs, which by then I could perfectly well do. I heard the huge clock in the hall strike 3:30. The clock had come from Palapra and reached the ceiling. I looked at my watch as I heard it. I was always doing that. It was very late autumn, just before Christmas, but not yet officially winter. There is nothing in this world I know better than exactly what day of the year it was. It is forever written in the air before me. My ears were made keen by always listening. Often, wherever I was, even at the top of the house, I waited motionless for the enormous clock to strike, lest the boom take me by surprise. But the ascending woman was upon me before I had heard a footfall. I admit that all the carpets were thickest Brussels and Wilton. I often heard footfalls, nonetheless, especially my father's strangely uneven tread. I do not think I heard the woman make a sound from first to last. But last was very close to first. She had come up the stairs, beyond doubt, even though I had neither heard nor seen anything, because by the time I did observe her, she was still 2 or 3 steps from the top of the flight. It was a wide staircase, but she was ascending in a very curious way, far further from the rail than was necessary and far nearer to the wall, and with her head and face actually turned to the wall. At that point, I did hear something. I heard someone shut the front door below, which could not be seen from where I stood. I was surprised that I had not heard the door being opened, and the words of inquiry and caution. I remember my surprise. All these sounds were unusual in our house at that time. I felt the cold air that the woman had brought in with her from the December streets and squares, and a certain cold smell, but she never once turned towards me. She could easily have been quite unaware of me, but I was watching her every motion. She had black hair, thin and lank. She was dressed in a dirty red and blue plaid of some kind, tightly wound. I was of course used to pictures of people in plaids. The woman's shoes were cracked and very unsuited to the slush outside. She moved with short steps, and across the carpet she left a thin trail of damp, though I knew that it was not raining. It was one of the things I always knew. Everything about the woman was of a kind that children particularly fear and dislike. Women, when frightening, are to children enormously more frightening than any man or men. I think I was too frightened even to shrink back. As the woman tottered past, I stood there with my boxes beside me. My idea of her motion was that she had some difficulty with it, but was sustained by extreme need. Perhaps that is a fancy that only came to me later. I never had any doubt about where the woman was going, but even so, I was unable to move or to speak or to do anything at all. As she traversed the few yards of the landing, she extended her right arm and grimy hand from out of her plaid, the hand and arm nearer to me, still without in any degree turning her head. In no time at all, and apparently without looking, she had opened the door of my sweet mother's room, had passed within, and had shut the door behind her. I suppose it is unnecessary for me to say that when my mother was ill, her door was never locked, but perhaps it is not unnecessary. I myself never entered at such times. My mother could not bear me to see her when she was ill. There was no one sympathetic to whom I could run crying and screaming. In such matters, children are much influenced by the facilities available. For me, there was only my mother, and, in fact, I think I might actually have gone in after the woman, though not boldly. However, before I was able to move at all, I heard Cuddy's familiar clump ascending the stair behind me as I gazed at the shut door. "What are you doing now?" asked Cuddy. "Who is that?" I asked. "Who is who?" Cuddy asked me back. "Or what?" "The woman who's gone in there." "Whist. It's time you were in bed with Christmas so near." "It wasn't Father Christmas," I cried. "I dare say not," said Cuddy. "Because it wasn't anybody." "It was, Cuddy. It was. Go in and look." It seems to me that Cuddy paused at that for a moment, though it may only have been my own heart that paused. It made no difference. "It's bed for you, man," said Cuddy. "You're overexcited, and we all know where that ends." Needless to say, it was impossible for me to sleep, either in the dark or in the light, the choice being always left to me, which was perhaps unusual in those days. I heard the hours and the half-hours all through the night, and at 1 or 2 o'clock my father's irregular step, always as if he were dodging something or someone imperfectly seen, and his periodical mutterings and jabberings as he plodded. All was deeply upsetting to a child, but I must acknowledge that by then I was reasonably accustomed to most of it. One explanation was that I had no comparisons available. As far as I knew, all people behaved as did those in my home. It is my adult opinion that many more, in fact, do so behave than is commonly supposed, or at least acknowledged. Still, that night must have proved exceptional for me, because when Cuddy came to call me in the morning, she found that I was ill too. Children, like adults, have diseases that it is absurd to categorize. Most diseases, perhaps all, are mainly a collapse or part collapse of the personality. I dare say a name for that particular malady of mine might in those days have been brain fever. I am not sure that brain fever is any longer permitted to be possible. I am sure that my particular malady went on for weeks, and that when I was once more deemed able to make sense out of things, I learned that my mother was dead and, indeed, long buried. No one would tell me where. I further gathered that there was no memorial. About 4 weeks after that, or so it now seems to me, but perhaps it was longer, I was told that my father was proposing to remarry, though he required the consent of the trustees. A judge was but a man as far as the trustees were concerned, a man within the scope of their own settlement and appointment. Thus it was that I acquired my stepmother, née Miss Agnes Emily Fraser, but at the moment a widow, Mrs. Johnny Robertson of Balk. To her the trustees had no objection, it seemed. I still have no idea of why my father married Agnes Robertson, or why he remarried at all. I do not think it can have been the motive that prompted his earlier marriage. From all that, since his death, I have learned of his ways, the notion would seem absurd. It was true that the lady had wealth. In the end, the trustees admitted as much, and that much of it was in Burma oil. I doubt whether this was the answer either. I do not think that more money could have helped my father very much. I am not sure that by then anything could have helped him. This is confirmed by what happened to him, conventional in some ways though it was. Moreover, the marriage seemed to me to make no difference to his daily way of life. The bench, the chambers, the club, the dining club, the livery company, the military historical society, the self-defense classes, the kirk, or, I am sure, to those other indulgences. On most nights, he continued to ponder and by fits and starts to cry out. I still tiptoed swiftly away and, if possible, hid myself when I heard his step. I seldom set eyes upon my stepmother, though of course I am not saying that I never did. I took it for granted that her attitude to me was at least one thing that she shared with my father. That seemed natural. I found it hard to see what else she had any opportunity of sharing. It had, of course, always been Cuddy to whom I was mainly obliged for information about my father's habits and movements, in so far as she knew them. Cuddy was much less informative about my stepmother. One new aspect of my own life was that my lessons had stopped. I believe that for more than a year I had nothing to do but keep out of the way and play, as far as was possible. Now, there seemed to be no callers at all, and assuredly not perfumiers and designers of lingerie. No doubt my stepmother's circle was entirely in Scotland, and probably to the north of the Forth and Clyde Canal. She would not have found it easy to create an entirely new circle in Belgravia. I suppose there were 2 reasons why I suffered less than I might have done from the unsatisfactory aspects of my situation. The first was that I could hardly suffer more than I was suffering from my sweet mother's death. The second reason was my suspicion that any other life I might be embarked upon would be even more unsatisfactory. In the end, the trustees intervened, as I have said, but before that, Cuddy had something to impart, at long last, about my stepmother. She told me that my stepmother was drinking. It debarred her, Cuddy informed me in a burst of gossip, from appearing in public very often. That was exactly how Cuddy expressed it, with a twinkle or a glint or whatever may be the Scottish word for such extra intimations. I gathered that my stepmother seldom even dressed herself, or permitted herself to be dressed by Cuddy. One thing I was not told and do not positively know is whether or not the poor lady was drinking as hard as this before her second marriage. It is fair to her to say that the late Johnny Robertson was usually described as a scamp or rogue. Certainly my stepmother's current condition was something that would have had to be concealed by everyone as far as possible at that time in Belgravia, and with her husband a high court judge. In any case, after the trustees had taken me away and sent me to an eminent school, I began to hear tales. At first, I knocked about those who hurled and spat them at me. I discovered a new strength in the process, just as the grounding, to use the favored word, provided by my mother enabled me to do better than most in class, not so much by knowing more as by using greater imagination and ingenuity. Qualities that tell even in rivalry among schoolboys. The jibes and jeers ceased, and then I began cautiously to inquire after the facts. The school was of the kind attended by many who really know such things. I learned that my father too had long been drinking, and was a byword for it in the counties and the clubs. No doubt in the jails also, despite my father's dislike of criminal jurisdiction. One morning, Jesperson, who was the son of a Labour ex-minister and quite a friend of mine, brought me the Times so that I could see the news before others did. I read that my father had had to be removed from his court and sent for treatment. The Times seemed to think that if the treatment were not successful, he might feel it proper to retire. There was a summary of the cases over which he had presided from such an unusually early age. Some of them had been attended by me, however fleetingly, and a reference to his almost universal popularity in mainly male society. I was by then in a position at school to take out any chagrin I might feel upon as many other boys as I wished, but I was too introspective for any such easy release, and instead began for the first time to read the Divine Comedy. There was nothing particularly unusual in what had happened to my father so far, but the treatment seems, as far as one can tell, to have been the conclusive ordeal, so that he died a year later in a mental hospital, like poor Haverstone, though not in the same one. My father returned in spirit to a sodden, picturesque wilderness and is buried in the kirkyard 4 or 5 miles by a very rough road from Palapra. It was the first instruction in his will, and the trustees heeded it, as a matter of urgency, to the last detail. I could not myself attend the funeral, as I was laid low by a school epidemic, though by then in my last term, and older than any of my confreres. My stepmother also missed the funeral, though she had returned to Scotland as soon as she could. She had resolved to remain there, and, for all I know, she is there still, with health and sobriety renewed. Several times I have looked her up in directories and failed to find her, despite reference to all 3 of her known surnames, but I reflect that she may well have married yet again. My father had left her a moiety of his free estate, in equal part with the various organizations he wished to benefit, and which I have already listed. She possessed, as I have said, means of her own. My father left me nothing at all, but he lacked power, judge though he was, and a Scots solicitor also, to modify the family settlement. Therefore I, as only surviving child, inherited a life interest in Palapra, though not in the house in Belgravia, and a moderate, though not remarkable, income for life. Had my brother survived, he would have inherited equally. Thinking about him, I wondered whether the demon drink, albeit so mighty among Scotsmen, had not rather been a symptom of my father's malady than the cause of it. Thinking of that, I naturally then thought about my own inwardness and prospects. Eugene O'Neill says that we become like our parents of the same sex, even when we consciously resolve not to. I wept for my mother, so beloved, so incomparable.